Hello everyone, and welcome to the opening episode of another exciting series. I'm going to turn my focus from large-scale ecology and global biomes and scale it down to the level of the cell and the individual organism. With that said, today I bring you episode 49 on the topic of plant development and plant physiology. What this means is that today I'll be beginning a study on plants, and what better place to start than at the beginning of a plant's life. I'll explore the process from seed to fully mature plant, exploring the body structure, the physiology, and the cellular structure of the plant at every level. This fundamental information will be vital to understanding the rest of the series, because I'll be talking about subjects like plant nutrition and sensory responses, and these can't really be fully understood without knowledge of the physical structures that are involved. Okay, so let's start at the very beginning with embryogenesis. I'll be exploring this process of development for a generic seed-bearing plant. When the pollen fertilizes an egg, it creates a zygote, and this exists inside of a small structure called an ovule. It's like a plant ovary, and from within this structure, the zygote develops into a seed. This process involves a rapid explosion in cellular growth, with the cells growing asymmetrically. This asymmetry in the cell's growth and expansion establishes an internal orientation for further cellular development, and this lays the groundwork for the cellular structure of the plant's entire body. The zygote itself is just one cell. It divides asymmetrically into a small apical cell on top and a larger basal cell on the bottom. So right away, this first division establishes an up and a down to the zygote, like a y-axis of cell growth, called the apical basal axis. The apical cell, which is the little one on top, will begin to divide into a spherical mass of cells, like a little ball, while the basal cell will divide vertically, and it'll create a one-cell thick chain, or a string of cells. This column of basal cells connects the globular ball of apical cells to the walls of the ovule, kind of like an umbilical cord connecting a mammal to a placenta, which is on the inside of the uterus. The basal cells aren't a permanent part of the organism, just like the umbilical cord isn't a permanent part of a mammal. The ball of apical cells will continue to expand until it's composed of hundreds of cells. Within this mass, within these hundreds of cells, there's going to be three distinct structures that will start to emerge. As the mass grows upwards along this apical basal axis, it'll form two prongs, two sheet-like prongs of cells, and these are called cotyledons. These will eventually grow into leaves, but I'll get to that in a minute. The second structure that emerges from the apical cell mass is the hypocotyl, which is an elongated central section that eventually forms the stem. The third structure is the root, but in the embryonic form, it hasn't really expanded at all. It just looks like a dome or a cap on the end of the apical cell mass. It's pretty wild how the fully grown, mature body structure of the plant is already represented from the very start in a handful of differentiating cells in the growing embryonic tissue of a seed. So there are 2 points, or 2 places in this growing mass of cells that are called meristems. Each meristem is a little clump of undifferentiated stem cells, which perpetually produces daughter cells. This constant cellular replication fuels the plant's primary growth. In the seed embryo, one of these is the apical shoot meristem, which exists at the top of the central mass of the cells, right at the cleft between the cotyledons. It's pretty well understood that plant cells have cell walls, and unlike animal cells, which just have a soft membrane, these plant cells and their cell walls, they grow into stiff, relatively immobile tissues and structures. As such, the shoot meristem is always at the very tip of the stem, always getting higher and higher into the air as the daughter cells divide and grow and solidify beneath them. Some of these daughter cells are specialized, and they'll participate in the growth of branches or leaves. This perpetual primary growth or vertical growth at the shoot apical meristem allows the plant to reach vertically into the air and for the branches to reach outward and take up a lot of space above the ground. The other group of meristem cells exists in the little nub of root tissue in the embryo. These root apical meristems do the same thing as the shoot cells, except they just grow down instead of up. Instead of expanding out into the air, the root meristems generate roots that dig and penetrate into the soil. What's interesting about the root meristems is that they generate a protective shield of dead cells on their tip, which acts kind of like a helmet for the stem cells of the meristem as the root grows and pushes through the soil. These dead cells, or these waste cells, I guess, they're cells that are pretty much designed to die. The dead cells are designed to scrape off against rocks and debris and hard pieces of soil and other kind of things that would otherwise damage the delicate living stem cells that happen to exist in the meristem. Once the plant embryo grows to a full-size seed and the internal biochemistry has established the plant's body plan, the seed has to germinate. In order for this to happen, the seed has to be exposed to a favorable condition, like wet soil, and this will initiate germination. Some seeds belong to trees in boreal and temperate forests, and these actually require the heat of a forest fire to initiate seed maturation. It's kind of like a signal to the trees that the ground has been cleared of brush, and now there's prime real estate available, and so they should spread their seeds right now. The heat from the fire acts like a chemical signal to the trees, telling them that the ground has been cleared of brush and that there's prime real estate available. And so if they want to successfully reproduce, they should spread their seeds out right now. Visible signs of germination, as is typical for most potted plants that you might have around your house, involve the seed cracking open and an extension of pale white root tissue snaking out of it, grasping around for moist soil. If the root is successful, it'll establish itself in the soil. It'll find somewhere where it can dig in and find purchase, and it'll stabilize the plant so that it can stand upright. Sometime later, as the root is established and the stem is standing upright, the seed husk will dry out and it'll fall off, or it'll be pushed off by the cotyledons, which have now grown into little green leaves. They were wrapped up against the inner layer of the seed husk, like the wings of a butterfly, days before it hatches from the cocoon built by its worm-shaped caterpillar form. This young plant, this seedling, has a simple cellular structure. The basal tip is the root, which penetrates into the ground and absorbs water and nutrients and provides a physical stability for the rest of the plant's body. The apical tip sits between the cotyledon leaves, and the hypocotyl has grown into a thin, fragile stem of cells. If you were to take a horizontal slice of the stem, you would see the three basic cell layers, or three basic tissue types, that compose the young, simple plant, from root to leaf. Through the center of the stem runs a cylindrical column of vascular tissue, like cellular pipes that bring water from the roots up into the leaves. Around the vascular tissue exists a thick mantle of ground tissue, and this is kind of like a cellular sandbox. These cells can participate in all sorts of activities, like the growth of branches, tubers, and other peripheral structures. A lot of these ground tissue cells also produce the hormones and chemical signals that the plant uses to coordinate its growth and fight disease. This mantle of ground tissue is covered in a thin layer of epidermis, sometimes just a single cell thick, and this seals in fluids, it keeps out dry air, and the epidermis protects the inner cells as they grow. As the plant matures, all of these tissues get thicker and more complex. The vascular tissue divides into multiple tubes. The ground tissue specializes into branches and storage organs and whatnot. And the epidermis includes the dynamic elements like stomata and cuticle-secreting cells. The leaves on the branches will grow and conduct life-sustaining photosynthesis, and the plant will get larger and spread its roots across a greater area. This implies a static, vegetative quality to the plant's life, which is the exact opposite of an animal, because animals are typically free-floating organisms that are capable of moving around under their own motion. I mean, sometimes you'll have really small animals like krill that can't swim against the current, but I mean, that's the exception, not the rule. Because they're stuck in one spot, plants can't escape bad weather. They can't escape herbivores should one come to eat them. The cactus in the Sahara have to endure the brutal heat and the lack of water, while wetland mangrove trees endure regular flooding and they have to endure these anoxic, muddy environments. The forests of larch trees in eastern Siberia have to endure the extreme winter cold, with some of the coldest terrestrial landscapes on the planet, with the exception of Antarctica. The static, immobile nature of plants means that evolutionary variables like the climate and the seasonal temperatures are able to apply selective pressure at full force. The plants can't run away from a Siberian winter. They can't run away from the endless sun of a Siberian summer. So only the hardiest lineages, only those that can handle the intense seasonal temperature differences and humidity differences, these are the only ones that are able to endure and perpetuate themselves. Not only do plants have to tolerate a wide variety of climate conditions, they have to deal with the immediate, local geography of where they're growing. For example, the presence of water in rivers, lakes, or swamps will help some plants. It'll be hydrating, especially for hydrophilic plants like marsh reeds and mangrove trees and stuff, but it'll drown out all the other plants that can't handle those kind of low oxygen, high water conditions. The plant has to get light, so growing on the north face of a mountain in the northern hemisphere is bound to limit the total plant biomass that can grow there. Plants with their bodies partly in the shade will grow and bend away from the shade. If a tree grew in full sunlight for most of its life, but then someone makes a building and half of the tree is covered by the shadow of the new building, the future growth of that tree will be in the branches that are still exposed to the sun, because those branches have leaves that can still conduct photosynthesis and generate carbon compounds. The branches in the shaded half, however, will shrivel and wither as the tree refocuses its growth to maximize its exposure to sunlight. In this way, the growth of the tree is kind of like a vertical, slow-motion version of the horizontal growth of fungus. In a petri dish, fungus will creep outwards to search for food. It'll grow denser in areas with lots of food, and it'll retract from or just leave areas that don't have any food. Out in nature, fungus do the same thing. They exist as this thin, creeping layer of hyphaea that kind of penetrates and moves throughout the soil. And where they find something dead or decaying that they can dissolve and eat, they'll focus on that. And in the areas of the soil where there's no nutrients, where there's nothing really for them to eat, the hyphaea will retract. They'll spread away from that. And so it's like this almost two-dimensional sheet of fibers seeking out food and slinking around the landscape. And trees will do this in the same way, just vertically, as do all plants pretty much. But plant food is sunlight. And so they grow up and out in 3 dimensions to find this sunlight, instead of growing across a 2-dimensional flatland like a fungus in a petri dish. Sometimes the shoot apical meristems will divide into specialized daughter cells called a floral meristem. This is basically a group of cells that will divide and grow into a flower. The floral meristem is carried along in the branch tissue until it gets deposited somewhere, typically on a node in the branch or at the end of a branch. And then once there, the flower tissue grows the flower structures, the flower tissues, and they flower during the species mating season. The cells within this floral meristem are also organized into differentiated sections, or rings in this case, with each ring being inside the next. In the model organism Arabidopsis, the plant's floral meristem has 4 layers, or 4 rings, and these grow from outermost ring to innermost ring into green leafy sepals, the flower petals themselves, then the pollen-producing stamen, and then lastly and most interiorly, the egg-producing carpels. The Arabidopsis is a model organism because it's pretty simple, morphologically and genetically. And because of its simplicity, any changes to its genotype can be readily observed in the phenotype. We can see what genes do what genes affect what part of the plant, and what effect this has on a macroscopic level. In this regard, the initial experimental studies of Arabidopsis flower formation on a genetic level had really fascinating results. Researchers validated their ABC theory when they found that there were 3 major groups of genes that get expressed in the cells of the floral meristem, with each group of genes, A, B, and C, only being expressed in 2 of the 4 layers, and each 2 layers were consecutive, they were side by side. So when you draw this out on a diagram, it creates 4 distinct gene group interactions, which I'll describe. And these are responsible for causing the cells to grow into the various differentiated tissue, into the sepals, into the flower petals, into the stamen, or into the carpels. So the green leafy tissue of the flower, the sepals, develop when the cells in the outermost ring of the floral meristem only express genes from the gene group that the researchers called A. This gene group A was also expressed in the next ring, in the consecutive ring. But so was gene group B. The interaction between gene group A and B, which are both expressed and so their proteins are interacting, this interaction creates the tissue of the flower petals. And if you've ever felt a flower, you know that the texture of the flower petals is much different than the texture of the sepals. Sometimes they're thinner and more delicate. Sometimes they might be thicker and denser. But there's a definite difference that you can notice visually and by touching it. I mean, the most obvious difference is that where sepals are typically green in angiosperms, the flower petals themselves are a huge range of colors, like the deep scarlet of a rose, the fiery oranges of a marigold, the soft purple of a violet. I mean, you get the idea. You've seen flowers before. You know what colors they can be. Anyways, the gene group B is expressed in both the petal cells, the cells of the flower petals, and in the next consecutive layer, in the next inner layer of stamen cells. But stamen cells also express the gene group C. And the way groups B and C interact, the way their enzymes interact and their proteins and stuff, this creates the stamen structures. And these are like long stalks that are tipped with a ball or a clump of pollen. And out in the wild, this will get released into the wind, and the wind will carry the pollen away, and hopefully it'll germinate some other tree and they'll reproduce. That's the general idea, at least. But there's also a lot of angiosperms that use insects as vectors to carry their pollen. I mean, I've talked about it a lot on this podcast. But the bees who come to get nectar out of flowers, they're attracted to the flower petals and their color and shape. And so the bees will fly and land on the flower. They'll get the nectar that they use as food, but the stamen will also simultaneously cover the bees, which are kind of furry and hairy, in pollen. And the bees will go from flower to flower, getting nectar, and as they do this, they're shaking off all this pollen into different flowers, into different plants. And by rubbing all of this pollen against the innermost part of the flower, they're pollinating it. The insect vector is fertilizing embryos for new plants to form. However, this innermost ring, this innermost layer of cells, they don't express gene group A. I mean, that was done with a while ago. They don't express gene group B. They only express gene group C. And just gene group C, just those proteins, will produce the tissues that we call carpels. These are the structures that produce the eggs. This early research on Arabidopsis flowers showed how groups of genes in differentiated cells could directly induce the growth of specific tissues and structures. The major physiological division in plants is between their roots, which are underground, and their shoots, which grow above ground. These two sides of the plant each perform critical functions for the plant as a whole. The resources that one side gathers are shared with the other side, so that both sides of the plant get the nutrients that they need, and both sides grow. In a nutshell, that's what makes for a happy plant. But I mean, that was a really simple kind of explanation. There's obviously a lot more detail than that. Each side, the roots and the shoots, has specific morphological features that really play into the relationship between surface area and volume. The root's epidermal tissue will often grow out numerous little root hairs, and these little thin root hairs maximize surface area and tremendously increase the root's capacity for absorbing water. Leaves adapt to their specific climate too, with smaller leaves existing in dry climates and larger leaves existing in wetter climates, as the high surface area of leaves promotes transpiration. This transpiration is the evaporation of water molecules off the leaf and into the air, which means the plant is losing water. In dry climates, like the desert or a shrubland, plants want to limit this water loss, and so their leaves are typically smaller. In wet climates, it's not as much of a problem. It's pretty humid outside, and it's humid inside the plant tissue, and because there's a relatively shallow gradient there, the rate of transpiration isn't going to be very high. Because this isn't much of a problem, the leaves get bigger, and so they can take advantage of as much sunlight as possible. Conversely, some tissue in the roots or the shoots will grow thick tubers that don't have a large surface area, but do have a large volume. These tubers, which we often eat, like yams and potatoes and carrots, are full of nutrients. In times of nutrient stress, the plant can tap the tuber and support itself for a little while. Or sometimes it uses the tuber as like a starting meal to promote growth at the beginning of a growth season or something like that. The root system is a really large, extensive part of the plant that mirrors the shoot system in a few interesting ways. Where the shoot apical meristem grows the plant upwards, the root apical meristem grows the plant downwards. This vertical downward growth in many species creates a taproot. This taproot stabs straight down into the soil, just as the stem rises straight up into the air. Where the stem has lateral branches, the taproot has lateral roots that grow outward and expand horizontally through the soil. But roots are much more extensive than the shoots. The roots grow out wide, far beyond the reach of the longest branch or leaf in the shoot, and they usually compose the majority of the plant's mass. In this way, plants are kind of like icebergs, in that the vast majority of their body lies submerged under the surface of their substrate. Something like 90% of an iceberg is below the water, while plants have more than 80% of their mass hidden in the soil. Roots demonstrate a variety of forms to meet certain criteria or to play specific ecological or physiological roles. For example, the local environment will play a huge role in the root's physiology. Imagine the sloping hillside of a valley, where the valley floor gets regularly flooded by a river. A tree that's growing on the hillside of this valley, where the soil is dry and well aerated, will grow roots that penetrate deeply into the soil and firmly anchor it to the hillside. But a tree of the same species that's living in the wetlands at the bottom of the valley will have small, kind of stubby, shallow roots, as they can't handle the muddy, anoxic soil that gets brought in by the floodwaters. Many trees exist in this situation, like many mangrove trees, that have root tips that will grow upwards and come back out of the soil in little protrusions called pneumatophores. These pneumatophores allow the roots to come up to the surface to breathe, almost like a dolphin or a whale comes up to breathe. And this is because the pneumatophores, this root tissue protruding back up out of the muddy ground, supplies oxygen to the root tissue that's submerged in the anoxic mud. This demonstrates a kind of open-ended phenotypic plasticity that helps the plants fit in and adapt to specific habitats. Because of this dynamic plastic growth that allows roots to adapt to whatever specific geographic form that they're growing on, the roots can grow towards areas in the soil that are rich in nutrients and water and that provide physical stability, while shrinking away from areas with no nutrients and no water. This mirrors the dynamic of the fungus-like growth patterns that are also seen in the shoot as it grows up and outwards to seek sunlight and avoid the shade. Some plants will store starches and nutrients in their tubers as a kind of breakfast package for a future growing season. During the tail end of one growing season, usually after the plant has spread its seeds, it'll begin investing resources, instead of into seeds, which it did earlier in the growing season, it'll invest its resources into the production of a tuber mass in the root tissue or somewhere deep in the shoot tissue. This tuber tissue will swell into a lumpy mass as the cells get packed with starches and nutrients, and these get stored over winter or between growing seasons, whatever it happens to be. During the next growing season, the plant will use these stored nutrients and starches that jumpstart the growth of a new shoot. In tropical and subtropical ecoregions, where water is plentiful and nutrients become available whenever something rapidly decays, Plant roots will grow in gnarled clumps. They'll fight each other for space and access to soil. But in ecoregions where resources are a little less easy to come by, where the soil is a little less rich, competing with other plants is a losing strategy. Competition is hard on every species involved because they have to exert more effort to fight off other individuals, in addition to the standard amount of effort that they need to accumulate resources against the punishing reality of nature itself. And that already takes a lot of energy. So competing with others just makes it that much harder. Because of this, there emerged an evolved avoidance of competition, and this is clearly demonstrated in prairies and grasslands, which are too dry for larger plants like trees to take root. In these grasslands, the various species of herbaceous plants have different root morphologies, so as to reach different layers of the soil than other plants, and this minimizes their competition. Some of these herbaceous plants don't grow a taproot. Instead, they just grow a loose collection of stringy root fibers that cascade down immediately below the plant's shoot. Other species have shallow fibrous roots that look like a little poof ball, and again, these don't extend very far into the soil at all. Then you have the herbaceous species that do have these centralized taproots. In some cases, the taproot is pretty thin, and it creeps down just a few centimeters, or maybe a meter or two below the plant. But in other cases, like with the compass plant, its taproot can reach more than 4 meters deep into the soil. Other plants might have roots that, instead of descending down vertically, will extend horizontally in a shallow layer of soil. And this is so they can kind of maybe tap soil that isn't being tapped by the other species whose roots focus on deeper ground. Okay, so that's the basics of the root system. Now I'm going to move on to the chute system. The shoot of a plant is what shoots upward. It's the visible part of the plant, above the ground, typically where all of the green stuff is. The central part of the shoot is the stem, which is the accumulated mass of all of the cells built on top of each other by the original apical meristem as it perpetually moved itself upwards. Many plant species have multiple stems growing out of an individual plant or a single root system. At intervals along these stems, there are structures called axillary buds, and these can grow into new stems coming laterally out of the main stem. They can become branches, and these can also host their own axillary buds that grow into new branches somewhere down the length of the original branch. These axillary buds are the growth points that create those forks in the branch, and this ultimately creates that fractal pattern that you see in a tree branch when you look at the whole thing, or when you look at a whole tree. And this is kind of like a river. Tributaries of a river merge together. It's fractal because it's the same repeating formation over and over again. The axillary buds grow at places along the stem or the branch that are called nodes. As do leaves. Leaves also grow on these nodes. Where the stems are capped with apical meristems that grow the plant upward, the branches are also tipped with similar groups of stem cells, and these are called apical buds. These apical buds exist at the tips of every branch, and they perpetuate its growth, laterally. If you live anywhere that isn't the polar Arctic, you should be able to look out your window and see a variety of plants. Plants show a huge diversity in their shoots, from size and color to chemical complexity and the types of tissues that are involved. Much like root systems, these chute systems are adapted to their environment and sculpted by the inherent evolutionary pressures therein. Dry areas have plants that are thick with succulent tissue, preserving water in an otherwise water-devoid landscape. Wet areas have plants with broad leaves, so as to encourage transpiration and water flow through their bodies. Windy landscapes typically knock down all their larger plants, so those that remain and thrive are shorter, stockier plants like shrubs, bushes, and grasses. Thick layers of bark can protect against herbivores, while woody tissue in general allows plants to support immense weight and grow really tall, which is all the better to compete for sunlight in heavily forested areas. Plant shoots have a wide range of unique features and evolved modifications that help them survive and reproduce in their specific habitats. I've mentioned tubers like potatoes and yams, which are stored masses of carbohydrates and nutrients that the plant taps into for future growing seasons. And I've also mentioned succulents. Succulents are usually xeric plants like cactus that don't really have branches or too many leaves, but instead turn themselves into standing water balloons. The thick green tissue of a cactus is covered in a waxy cuticle to seal in moisture, and the photosynthetic tissue removes the need for leaves, which are water wasteful anyway because of their high surface area. Cactus also has thorns, and this deters herbivores, and these thorns are another kind of adapted shoot tissue. The horns are literally sharp cones of stem tissue that end in a sharp point. When a large animal, like your typical grazing herbivore, comes by to eat the plant, it gets these thorns poking into its nose and its lips, and that pain, in a particularly sensitive area of the face, will deter the herbivore from trying to eat the plant again. Some plants have stem structures called stolons, which grow horizontally across the surface of the soil. The stolons create nodes, and at these nodes, they grow entirely new roots and shoots, and so this is effectively a whole new individual plant. In this way, the stolons are actually a key structure in asexual reproduction, as they reach out across the soil and generate clones that will grow into the soil and kind of bud off, in a manner of speaking. There's a specialized kind of stem called a rhizome that also grows horizontally and produces clones. But unlike the stolon, and most shoot structures in general, the rhizome grows underground. Perhaps the most important part of the shoot is the leaf. Almost all plants have leaves, but depending on the plant, these leaves can have a wildly diverse form and function. The spine, or the stalk of the leaf, is called the petiole, and the broad, thin, green sheet of leaf tissue is called the blade. The combined surface area of all the blades on a plant typically represents all of its photosynthetic tissue, and this determines the maximal amount of light that it can absorb and process at a given time. Leaves that are grown directly in the sun tend to be smaller but thicker, while leaves grown in the shade tend to be thinner, but the blade is larger, broader. This differential growth is influenced by economic trade-offs. The leaves in the sun are always absorbing light, so they're always photosynthesizing. They're really productive. They don't need to be big, and if they were too big, they might block out light from the leaves below them, or they might overheat and get damaged. Larger leaves are more common in the shade, in the undercanopy, where they grow large so as to maximize their chances at catching sunlight as it filters through the canopy. Some plants want the benefits of large leaves, but they can't grow that much biomass. So instead of having one single large leaf, they'll have compound leaves, where one petiole has a blade composed of multiple little leaves, or leaflets. These leaflets cover a decent area and they can reach more sunlight, and they're also less troubled by strong winds and dry climate conditions. And of course, different plants will have different kinds of leaves that are all adapted for a wide range of functions and ecological purposes. Succulent leaves, like the famous aloe vera plant, are thick and swollen with reserves of water-filled tissue. Pitcher plants have leaves that grow into cups, adapted to trap insects for food. And angiosperms have specialized leaves called flowers that attract pollinators and assist in reproduction. The roots and the shoots grow through a process called primary growth, which I mentioned and discussed briefly at the beginning of the episode, but I didn't go into too much detail. This primary growth goes on throughout the plant's life, as the stem cells of the meristem perpetually divide. These meristems are organized into 3 groups of stem cells that produce the 3 major tissues of the plant: the epidermis, the ground tissue, and the vascular tissue, which I also mentioned earlier in the episode. The single-celled outer layer of the plant, the epidermis, is generated from the protoderm. These protoderm cells will generate the cells that secrete the waxy cuticle layer to seal in moisture, and they also generate the guard cells of the stoma, which are little openings in the plant that play a critical role in gas exchange and the regulation of transpiration. The ground meristem generates the ground tissue, which is the biomass between the epidermis and the vascular tissue inside the core of the plant. The ground tissue works kind of like the plant's organs. It has all the cells that produce all the specialized biomolecules that a plant needs, like toxins to defend itself, pigments to attract pollinators, and hormones to synchronize and orchestrate the plant's growth and internal homeostasis. The ground tissue also holds the bulk of the chloroplasts and its parenchyma cells, and these do the vast bulk of the plant's photosynthesis. The ground tissue also provides structural support via collenchyma cells, which are rich in cellulose, and sclerenchyma cells, which have secondary cell walls that contain both cellulose and lignin. And this is a pretty sturdy structural molecule that provides a lot of support, a lot of physical and mechanical support to the plant. The vascular tissue itself is generated by the procambium, which has two major tissue subtypes, the phloem and the xylem. The phloem is composed of cellular tubes that transport sugar, hormones, and other nutrients both up and down the plant. In this way, the phloem fully integrates the growth of the roots and the shoots, and it helps create the vascularized network that allows the shoots and the roots to share resources with each other. The xylem, on the other hand, only moves water, and it only moves water in one direction, from the roots to the shoots. As these stem cells generate the specialized cell types in each type of tissue, the new cells go through a brief period of maturation. So for example, let's consider the meristem of the shoot. The shoot apical meristem is right there on the top of the plant. Immediately below the meristem, are the youngest cells, and these are still actively dividing. But past this zone of division, further down, the cells have generally stopped dividing, and they're now focused on growing and elongating. Below this zone, the mature cells are finalizing their differentiation, and they're becoming the specialized cells they were genetically programmed to be, and their cell walls are hardening into place. These zones of growth and maturation follow the meristems, leaving behind a cellulose-rich structural matrix of mature cells that have hardened into their final arrangements. Plants can be divided into two groups based on how they arrange their vascular and their ground tissue inside the stems and branches. In all plant species, the vascular tissue is grouped into bundles of fibrous tubes running down the length of the stem. The difference is in how these vascular bundles are positioned throughout the stem. If you were to take a cross-section of a plant called a eudicot, you would see that their vascular bundles are arranged in a ring near the inner edge of the epidermis, so a ring of vascular bundles kind of near the outer edges of the plant's stem. The thin layer of ground tissue between the vascular bundles and the epidermis is called the cortex, while the general bulk of ground tissue inside the ring is called the pith. However, in the other group of plants, called monocots, this stem cross-section would show the vascular bundles scattered randomly throughout the ground tissue. Once a plant has created a stem and branches through its primary growth, these structures can be widened in some plants through secondary growth. Some plants are able to widen these structures through secondary growth. The secondary growth is designed to provide more conducting vascular tissue to move water and sugar and nutrients, and to provide structural support for the extra primary growth that will be enabled by all this extra water and nutrients. In this way, the rates of primary and secondary growth have a kind of interdependent relationship. The secondary growth creates woody tissue, which is a defining feature of plants like trees. These plants have a unique kind of meristem called a cambium. Where the apical meristems are small, localized groups of cells at the tips of the plant, the cambium is a giant cylinder that lines the root or the stem or the branches with a one-cell thick layer of these meristem cells. The vascular cambium is a layer that exists between the secondary layers of xylem and phloem. Because it's a continually living, growing cell layer, it can actually expand. It hasn't hardened into place yet. And as it expands, the cells growing off of the outside of the vascular cambium become part of this phloem layer, while cells growing off of the inside of the vascular cambium become xylem. These layers are called secondary xylem and secondary phloem, because they're produced through secondary growth, whereas the primary growth of the apical meristems creates primary xylem and primary phloem. Anyways, there's another cylinder of cork cambium, another cylinder of these dividing cells that exist right above the vascular cambium. This cork cambium allows the epidermis to expand, allows it to swell to accommodate the plant's secondary growth. These layers of cork cells will become bark, which is the characteristic outer layer of woody plants like trees. It's this secondary growth that also creates the characteristic age rings that you see in a tree when you cut it down. Sometimes the secondary growth is dependent on the temperature and the nutrients of the season, and so the years of the life's tree can be seen in the rings, seen in the cellular growth as it has more or less access to nutrients. During the beginning of the growing season, they produce early wood, which has large cells with thin cell walls. The tissue looks light, and so when you're looking at a cut tree, this will be the lighter tissue between the rings. As the growing season progresses, the cells get smaller, and their cell walls will get thicker. And so this creates late wood that's produced at the end of the growing season, and it's dense and it's dark, and these are the rings that you see in the tree. This creates that stereotypical ring pattern that you can count that will let you see how old the tree is. Alright, well, I want to wrap the episode up because I've been talking for a while, but plants are really complicated. Plants are really detailed, and I kind of feel like I didn't do them justice with this episode. I feel like I didn't even scratch the surface of what plants are. But hopefully I can kind of give you the full picture with the rest of this series, because in the following episodes, I'm going to be talking about plant hydration, how they move water and sugar. I'm going to be talking about plant nutrition, how they absorb nutrients and ions and use those to feed themselves and grow their tissues. I'm going to be talking about plant senses, how they sense light and darkness and up and down with gravity, and how they can tell that an herbivore is eating their leaves. I'm going to be talking about how plants reproduce, and I'm going to be talking about photosynthesis, which is the fundamental chemical process that makes plant life possible. If any of this sounds interesting, if you enjoyed this episode and you want to hear more of this stuff, if you want to learn more about plants, then just stick around, because I'm going to explore all this stuff in a lot greater detail. And as always, thanks for listening.
Would you like to support the BioLogic podcast? It's super easy. When you open a new episode, press the like button or share it with your friends. If you aren't subscribed, you should hit the subscribe button so you can enjoy a new episode every week. You can also peruse our official store, which has a ton of cool stuff like hand-designed t-shirts, hoodies, and stickers. All the links you need are in the description section below.